Our story begins in a quiet, unassuming suburb in 2019. You know the type. Manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and friendly neighbors who always greet each other with a wave. This particular neighborhood was in Denver, Colorado, where life moved at a peaceful, predictable pace. People here knew each other, swapped stories, and shared weekend BBQs. And at the center of it all were Mark and Emma, a couple everyone admired. Mark was the kind of guy who never missed a beat. In his early 40s, he had the self-assured air of someone who knew his place in the world. He ran his own contracting business, built from the ground up, and was known for being honest and hardworking. People trusted him not only because he did a great job but because he genuinely cared. He had those family man vibes, loyal, reliable, the guy you could count on in a pinch. Emma, on the other hand, was the spark in Mark's life. Where Mark was steady and grounded, Emma was bright and energetic. At 38, she had a youthful spirit that made her the life of every neighborhood get-together. She was deeply involved in the local community, from PTA meetings to charity drives. Emma was someone who lit up the room, the kind of person who made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the world. They had 2 kids, Bella and Jamie, both in high school, and as far as everyone knew, the Lucases were the perfect family. Or at least that's what it looked like from the outside. Now, it wasn't that their marriage was picture perfect. Far from it. They'd had their ups and downs like anyone else. Years of juggling work, kids, and bills had taken their toll, and the spark they'd once shared wasn't quite as bright. Mark noticed it too. Recently, Emma seemed a bit more distant, a little less interested in their usual routines. He tried brushing it off, convincing himself it was just a phase. After all, they'd been together for almost 20 years. And in any marriage, there are seasons, right? Some are warmer and others can feel a little cold. But then came an unexpected twist in their lives. Emma, who had always been passionate about staying active, joined a new yoga studio. It seemed harmless enough, a new hobby to break up the routine. She was excited about it, always chatting about how relaxing it was, how good it made her feel. First, Mark was happy for her. She was doing something she enjoyed, and it even seemed to lift her mood. He noticed she was paying a little more attention to her appearance, trying out new outfits, even wearing a touch of makeup on days she didn't used to. It was subtle, and for a while, Mark just chalked it up to Emma embracing her confidence. But then things started to change. Emma became a bit more secretive. She'd spend extra time on her phone, texting someone and laughing at messages. But when Mark would ask her about it, she'd just brush it off as a friend from yoga. There were times she'd leave the room to answer a call, or would quickly swipe her phone screen closed if he glanced over. Mark couldn't help but feel a pang of suspicion, but he pushed it down, trying to stay rational. It's probably just a friend, he told himself. No need to make something out of nothing. However, as weeks went by, the changes became harder to ignore. Emma was out of the house more often, attending yoga classes, going out afterward for drinks with the girls, and coming home later than usual. She'd slip into bed after midnight, claiming she lost track of time, but Mark started noticing that she didn't smell like her usual lavender lotion. There was a faint hint of something unfamiliar, like men's cologne. He convinced himself he was just overthinking, blaming the long hours at work and the distance growing between them. Still, that nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. One evening, Mark decided to check in with one of Emma's friends from the neighborhood, Lisa, who he knew was also in the yoga group. They bumped into each other at a community event, and he casually asked, "So, how's yoga going with Emma? Seems like you guys have a fun group." Lisa looked at him, a bit confused, and said, "Oh, I haven't been going much lately. Emma's actually been doing private classes with that new instructor, Adam." I thought she'd mentioned it. Mark felt his stomach drop. Emma hadn't mentioned anything about private classes, let alone with an instructor. But he forced a smile and nodded, pretending as if he knew. The rest of the conversation blurred as his mind raced, piecing together all the little signs he'd tried to ignore. Private classes? Why hadn't she told him? And who was this Adam, anyway? Back at home, Mark couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. He found himself lying awake at night, glancing at Emma beside him, wondering if there was something she wasn't telling him. Days turned into a week, and the curiosity turned into a need to know. So, one Saturday afternoon, when Emma mentioned she was heading out for a yoga session, Mark decided to follow her. He didn't want to believe there was anything wrong, but he needed to see for himself. Mark trailed her car from a distance, feeling a mix of guilt and desperation. Part of him felt terrible for not trusting her, but he also knew he couldn't live with this nagging feeling any longer. He watched as Emma parked outside a small building that wasn't the yoga studio she'd told him about. Instead, it was an apartment complex. She stepped out of the car, checking her phone, and after a few moments, a man, tall, fit, and with that unmistakable yoga instructor aura, appeared and waved her over. Mark's heart sank. There was no mistaking it. She wasn't there for yoga. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. All those nights he'd spent reassuring himself, dismissing his doubts as paranoia, suddenly felt like a foolish attempt to ignore the truth. Emma had been lying to him, and now, standing there, hidden in his car with his heart racing, he was forced to confront what he'd tried so hard to deny. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn. Instead of storming out of his car, confronting her, and demanding answers, Mark decided to take a different approach. He wanted to understand what had led them here, what could have pushed Emma into the arms of someone else. Instead of anger, he felt a wave of sadness, a deep sense of loss for the life they'd built together. So he went home, determined to figure out how to handle this without tearing apart their family. Back at the house, Mark sat in the quiet of their living room, reflecting on all the moments that had led to this. The late nights, the distractions, the little arguments that had started to pile up over the years. He wondered if he'd missed signs along the way, if he'd taken her for granted, focusing too much on work and not enough on their relationship. And now, here they were on the brink of something he'd never imagined. When Emma returned home that evening, she looked almost too casual, like she was putting on a front. Mark couldn't bring himself to say anything, not yet. Instead, he watched her as she moved around the kitchen, laughing with their kids, acting as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. Mark spent the next few days in an emotional fog. He was struggling to come to terms with what he'd seen, but he couldn't bring himself to confront Emma. Maybe part of him was still hoping there was some other explanation, something that didn't involve her lying to him. But he knew better. There was no denying the truth anymore. As the days passed, Mark started to notice more signs he'd overlooked before. Emma's phone was practically glued to her side, and she'd go out for what she called yoga sessions multiple times a week now. She'd come back with an energy he hadn't seen in her for years, almost like she was a different person. He tried to act normal, keeping up appearances with the kids and pretending everything was fine. But deep down, the distance between him and Emma was growing, and he felt it every time she walked out the door. One evening, after another one of Emma's long outings, Mark decided it was time to confront her. He couldn't keep living with this gnawing doubt, and he had to know the truth. He waited until the kids were in bed, and then he took a deep breath and asked her directly, "Emma, what's really going on? Are you seeing someone else?" She froze, her eyes widening for a brief second before she quickly composed herself. "Mark, what are you talking about?" she replied, her voice too calm, too rehearsed. But Mark didn't let her off the hook that easily. "I know you're not going to yoga every night, Emma. I know you're meeting someone," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a long pause as she looked down, avoiding his gaze. Finally, she let out a sigh, admitting, "Okay, there's something I need to tell you." She went on to explain, in halting sentences, that she had been spending time with Adam, her yoga instructor. But according to her, it was nothing serious, just someone she'd connected with, someone who made her feel seen and valued. She tried to downplay it, saying it was just innocent, and that she hadn't meant to hurt him. But Mark couldn't help feeling betrayed. That conversation marked a turning point. After that night, things were different between them. Mark found himself pulling away, closing himself off emotionally. He couldn't look at Emma the same way, and he felt an ache in his chest whenever he thought about her with someone else. She tried to assure him it was nothing, that it wouldn't happen again. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had been shattered. To distract himself, Mark threw himself even deeper into his work. He started taking on more projects, staying late at the office, and distancing himself from home as much as possible. But the pain was still there, lingering in the background no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. Meanwhile, Emma seemed to be on her own journey. She started seeing a therapist and insisted that she wanted to work things out, to rebuild their marriage. But every time Mark looked at her, he was reminded of the lies, of the broken trust between them. He wanted to believe her, to give her a second chance, but he wasn't sure if he could. It was around this time that Mark decided to do something he'd never done before. He reached out to an old friend, Sam, who'd been through something similar. Sam had always been a solid guy, dependable and loyal, and Mark felt he could trust him. So one evening, after work, he called Sam and asked if they could meet up for a drink. They met at a quiet bar downtown, and after a few beers, Mark opened up about everything that had been going on. Sam listened, nodding thoughtfully, and then shared some of his own experiences. He told Mark about the importance of setting boundaries, of taking time to heal before making any big decisions. And he advised him to think about what he really wanted, whether that meant trying to rebuild with Emma or moving on. Talking to Sam gave Mark a new perspective. He realized that he needed to take control of his life, to stop letting Emma's actions dictate his happiness. He decided to take things one day at a time, focusing on himself and his own well-being. He started going to the gym, spending more time with the kids, and finding small ways to bring joy back into his life. But things weren't easy. Emma kept reaching out, trying to repair the relationship, but Mark felt torn. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to give them a fresh start, but another part couldn't let go of the betrayal. It was a constant battle between his heart and his mind, and he wasn't sure which side would win. One night, Emma suggested they go on a weekend trip, just the two of them, to see if they could reconnect. Reluctantly, Mark agreed, thinking it might be worth a shot. They drove to a cozy cabin in the mountains, a place where they'd once vacationed with the kids years ago. The air was crisp, the stars were bright, and for a moment, it felt like they were back in the early days of their relationship. They spent the weekend hiking, talking, and trying to find common ground. Emma was open, vulnerable, and seemed genuinely remorseful for what had happened. She promised Mark that she was committed to making things right, that she would do whatever it took to regain his trust. And for a brief moment he felt a glimmer of hope, a small voice in his head telling him that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this. But when they returned home, reality hit him all over again. The house, the routines, the daily reminders of the life they'd built together. It all felt tainted now. He couldn't escape the images in his mind, the feeling that something sacred had been broken. And as much as he wanted to move forward, he found himself questioning everything. That's when he decided to take a break, to step back and give himself some space. He told Emma that he needed time to figure things out, to decide if he could truly forgive her. She was devastated, pleading with him to stay, but he stood his ground. He knew that this was something he had to do for himself, that he needed to find peace before he could consider rebuilding their relationship. During this time, Mark focused on his own healing. He spent more time with friends, reconnected with hobbies he'd once enjoyed, and began to rediscover parts of himself that had been lost over the years. And slowly, bit by bit, he started to feel whole again. Emma, on the other hand, struggled to accept the separation. She reached out to him frequently, sending messages, trying to prove that she'd changed. But Mark remained distant, keeping his focus on himself and his own growth. As weeks turned into months, he found a sense of clarity. He realized that he could forgive Emma, but he wasn't sure if he could ever truly forget. The love they'd once shared had been replaced by a quiet sadness, a longing for the way things used to be. And while he still cared for her, he knew that moving forward meant making a choice, whether to stay and try to rebuild, or to let go and start anew. It's a decision many people face, and there's no right or wrong answer. Sometimes, love means holding on, fighting through the pain to find a way back to each other. But other times, love means letting go, allowing both people to heal and grow in their own way. And there you have it, the difficult journey of a man faced with betrayal, heartbreak, and the search for meaning in a world turned upside down. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of love, trust, and redemption. As time passed, the distance between Mark and Emma grew more pronounced. What had once been a few quiet weeks turned into months of strained, minimal contact. Every interaction between them felt charged, like something unsaid was lurking beneath the surface, and yet neither of them seemed able to address it. They were living separate lives under the same roof, held together only by their kids and a history that felt more like a memory with each passing day. It was around this time that Emma made a desperate move to close the gap. She proposed couples therapy, hoping it might bring them back to a place of understanding and help them work through the lingering bitterness that had seeped into their relationship. Mark, still conflicted but willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, agreed. He wasn't sure what he hoped to get out of it, but he knew they couldn't go on the way they were. Something had to change, and he was open to giving it one last try. Their sessions began awkwardly. Mark was guarded, wary of letting down his walls too soon. Emma, on the other hand, seemed genuinely remorseful, repeatedly expressing how sorry she was and how much she wanted to make things right. But words only went so far. The therapist pushed them to open up, to confront the root of their issues, but Mark found himself holding back. He wanted to believe Emma's sincerity, but there was a part of him that couldn't forget the hurt she'd caused. One night, after a particularly emotional session, Emma came to him with tears in her eyes. "Mark," she whispered, "I know I've messed up. I know that I hurt you, that I betrayed our trust. But I want to fix this. I want us to find a way back to each other." Her voice broke, and she reached out, placing a tentative hand on his arm. "Please just give me a chance. Let me show you that I'm committed to making this work." Mark looked at her, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to believe that they could rebuild what had been broken. But another part, a part that had grown stronger over the months of separation, wasn't sure if he could let go of the past. He took a deep breath, pulling away slightly, and said, "Emma, I need time. I need to figure out if I can trust you again. This isn't something I can just forget." Their relationship continued in this state of limbo, with both of them trying but neither fully committing to reconciliation. They'd made progress in therapy, but the underlying tension remained, an invisible barrier that kept them at arm's length. Mark knew he couldn't go on like this forever, but he wasn't ready to make a final decision just yet. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a quiet Friday evening, and Mark had just come home from work. He was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained from the constant back and forth with Emma. He walked into the kitchen, expecting to find her there preparing dinner, but the room was empty. Confused, he called out for her, his voice echoing through the silent house. No response. A sudden wave of dread washed over him. He knew that Emma had been making an effort to stay home more, to show him she was committed to their family. But something about the empty house, the silence, felt wrong. He grabbed his phone and dialed her number, his heart racing as it rang and rang with no answer. Minutes later, he received a text message. It was from Lisa, one of Emma's close friends in the neighborhood. The message was brief, but it sent a chill down his spine. "Mark, I thought you should know. I just saw Emma leaving Adam's apartment." For a moment, he couldn't breathe. All the progress they'd made, all the attempts at rebuilding trust, it felt like it had just crumbled to dust. Without thinking, Mark grabbed his keys and drove to Adam's apartment, his mind racing with a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. When he arrived, he parked a few buildings away, his heart pounding as he scanned the area. And then he saw her, Emma, stepping out of the apartment complex, looking around nervously before hurrying to her car. Mark felt a surge of rage but forced himself to stay calm, to wait until he could confront her back at home. He watched as she drove off, unaware that he was there, watching her betrayal unfold. That night, Mark waited for her to come home. He was sitting in the living room, his arms crossed, the tension radiating off him like a storm. When Emma walked through the door, she froze, her eyes widening as she took in his expression. She knew. He didn't have to say a word. She knew that he'd seen her, that he'd caught her in yet another lie. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Mark unleashed months of pent-up anger and resentment, his voice shaking as he demanded to know the truth. Emma tried to explain, to justify her actions, but her excuses only fueled his fury. He couldn't believe he'd let himself be deceived again, that he'd allowed himself to hope for a second chance only to be blindsided by her betrayal. "Was this your plan all along?" he yelled, his voice filled with anguish. "To string me along, to make me believe that we could fix things, while you were still seeing him behind my back? Do you even care about this family? Or was it all just an act?" Emma broke down, sobbing, as she tried to convince him that it hadn't meant anything, that she'd only gone to Adam because she was confused and didn't know how to handle the distance between them. But Mark was done listening. He couldn't take any more lies, any more empty promises. In that moment, he knew that their marriage was over. The next few days were a blur of anger, sorrow, and regret. Mark began the process of filing for divorce, determined to move on from the pain and betrayal that had consumed his life. Emma moved out of the house, and their children were devastated by the news, struggling to understand why their family was falling apart. Mark did his best to be there for them, to reassure them that they would get through this, but inside he was shattered. The divorce proceedings were painful, but Mark felt a sense of relief as he started to rebuild his life. He focused on his work, his kids, and his own healing, determined to find peace and happiness on his own terms. It wasn't easy. There were days when the memories of their life together haunted him, when he questioned whether he could have done something differently. But over time, he learned to let go, to accept that some things were beyond his control. Months later, as he looked back on everything he'd been through, Mark realized that he had grown stronger. The betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about resilience, self-worth, and the importance of surrounding himself with people who genuinely cared about him. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Free from the lies, the deception, and the weight of a relationship that had lost its foundation. And as he stepped into his new life, he knew that he would never settle for anything less than the love and respect he deserved. Mark's world was shaken, and the fallout of Emma's final betrayal left him in pieces. He couldn't recognize the person he'd once considered his closest friend, his partner. Every time he thought about that night, about seeing her walk out of Adam's apartment, he felt the painful reality settle deeper into his bones. The divorce was inevitable, and both he and Emma knew it. The tension between them now was palpable, each conversation an awkward attempt to manage logistics without any real emotion. But that didn't mean it was easy. In fact, as the divorce proceedings dragged on, things grew more intense. One of the hardest moments came when the reality of co-parenting hit. Mark knew he couldn't deny the kids their mother, despite everything that had happened. So, as they sat together in the lawyer's office, discussing custody arrangements, he felt a deep, simmering anger that he struggled to keep in check. Emma sat across from him, looking a shadow of her former self. He could see that the weight of her actions had finally sunk in, but it was too late for sympathy. He had one goal: to protect his kids from as much pain as possible. The lawyer outlined a plan for joint custody, ensuring both parents would have a role in their children's lives. Mark felt his heart twist at the thought of seeing less of his kids, but he knew he couldn't be selfish. His goal now was to make the transition as smooth as possible for them, even if it meant working with the person who'd hurt him more than anyone else. The kids, sensing the tension, were doing their best to adjust, but the changes were taking a toll on everyone involved. As weeks turned into months, Mark struggled to find his footing in this new life. He threw himself into his work, spent more time with friends, and tried to piece together some semblance of normalcy. But every now and then, he'd feel the sting of betrayal all over again. Nights were the hardest, when the house was silent, and he'd catch himself reaching for his phone to send Emma a goodnight text, only to remember how things had changed. The emptiness was suffocating, but he knew he had to keep going. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, he received a message from Sam, his old friend. Sam suggested they meet up at a bar downtown to catch up. Mark agreed, hoping it might be a good distraction. When they met, Sam wasted no time in noticing the change in Mark's demeanor. "You're different," Sam said, his tone concerned. "It's like you've been carrying the weight of the world." Mark sighed, knowing there was no point in hiding it. He opened up about everything, the pain, the anger, the hollow feeling that had become his constant companion. Sam listened intently, offering words of encouragement and reminding Mark that he wasn't alone. "You've been through hell, man, but look at you. You're still standing. That's something to be proud of," Sam said, clapping him on the shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it reminded Mark that he had support, that he didn't have to face this journey on his own. As the night wore on, Mark felt a weight lift, even if only temporarily. The conversation with Sam gave him the clarity he'd been searching for. He realized that moving on didn't mean erasing the past, but rather accepting it and using it as fuel to rebuild his life. From that night on, Mark made a promise to himself. He would no longer let his pain define him. In the following weeks, Mark started taking steps toward healing. He signed up for a new gym, began working with a therapist, and even took up a cooking class. These small changes gave him a sense of control over his life, a reminder that he could still find happiness on his own terms. The therapist, Dr. Keller, was especially helpful, guiding him through the process of letting go and helping him confront the lingering resentment he harbored toward Emma. Their sessions were challenging, but each one brought him closer to a place of acceptance. Meanwhile, Emma reached out occasionally, mostly about matters concerning the kids. Her messages were polite, respectful, almost hesitant, as if she knew any misstep could lead to more conflict. But there was one message that caught him off guard. She asked if they could meet just to talk, no strings attached. Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to see her face to face without feeling the tidal wave of emotions he'd worked so hard to manage. But after giving it some thought, he agreed. They met at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a place neither of them had been before. When he walked in, he saw her sitting by the window, looking pensive and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. She offered a weak smile as he approached, but he could see the guilt and regret etched on her face. They ordered their drinks, and for a few moments, they sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. Finally, Emma broke the silence. She looked down at her coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Mark, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. Truly. I know that doesn't make up for anything, and I know I can't take back what I did, but I need you to know that I regret it every day. I just wish I could turn back time." Mark felt a surge of emotions, but he took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "Emma, I've moved past the anger," he replied quietly. "I don't hate you, but I can't forget what happened either. I'm focusing on our kids, on my own life, and I think that's best for both of us." He looked her in the eyes, a sense of finality settling between them. There was no going back, and they both knew it. Emma nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They finished their coffee in silence, a quiet understanding hanging in the air. When they left the coffee shop, Mark felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the ending he'd hoped for, but it was an ending nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, Mark continued focusing on his new life, finding comfort in his routines and the support of his friends and family. He knew that healing was a journey, one that wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to finding peace. He started planning more activities with his kids, strengthening his bond with them and creating new memories to replace the painful ones. Looking back, Mark realized that he had come a long way from the man he'd been at the beginning of this ordeal. He was stronger, wiser, and more resilient, and while the pain of betrayal still lingered, it no longer defined him. He had learned to let go, to forgive, not for Emma's sake, but for his own. Mark's journey reminds us that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Moving forward is never easy, especially when the past keeps pulling you back. But with each step, he found a little more of himself, a little more strength to face whatever came next. If you've been through something similar, or you just enjoy stories of resilience and self-discovery, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. We have more stories coming that dive into the complex, messy, but ultimately inspiring journeys that life often takes us on. Mark's path to healing was steady but not without setbacks. He'd have moments where he'd think back to the life he and Emma once shared, and even though he was learning to let go, some memories still stung. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and despite his progress, there was still a part of him that felt unresolved. However, life had a way of surprising him, and he was about to face one of the most unexpected turns yet. One evening, as Mark was preparing dinner with his daughter Bella, she casually mentioned something that caught him completely off guard. "Dad," she said, "did you know Mom's thinking about moving back to Denver?" Mark paused, his hands frozen mid-chop. "Moving back?" he repeated, his voice laced with surprise. Emma hadn't mentioned anything like that. In fact, their post-divorce relationship had been amicable but minimal. Aside from the usual discussions about the kids, they didn't communicate much, let alone discuss something as big as a move. Bella nodded, unaware of the impact her words were having. "Yeah. She mentioned it when she dropped me off last week. She said she thinks it would be good for a fresh start, after everything." Mark finished making dinner, but his mind was elsewhere, racing through the implications of Emma's potential move. Denver was over 1,000 miles away. If she left, it would mean limited time with the kids, more travel expenses, and a whole host of logistical challenges. And while he and Emma were no longer together, the thought of her taking the kids that far away made him feel uneasy. Later that night, after Bella and Jamie had gone to bed, Mark found himself pacing the living room, unable to shake the feeling of unease. He wrestled with his thoughts, wondering if he should call Emma to confront her directly. He didn't want to come off as controlling or overbearing, but he also knew that the kids' lives were at stake, and he couldn't just sit by while she made such a big decision unilaterally. The following day, Mark decided to call Emma. As the phone rang, he took a deep breath, preparing himself for what could turn into a difficult conversation. When she picked up, her voice sounded guarded, as though she'd been expecting this call. "Emma, I heard from Bella that you're thinking of moving back to Denver," he began, trying to keep his tone steady. "I wanted to talk about it, especially considering how it would impact the kids." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Yes, I've been considering it," Emma admitted, her voice quiet. "I thought it might be best to get a fresh start, away from everything here. But I was going to talk to you about it. I promise." Mark could sense the hesitation in her voice, and he couldn't help but feel frustrated. "Emma, the kids need stability, especially after everything they've been through. Moving them across the country, away from their school, their friends, their home, it's a lot to ask. Have you really thought this through?" Emma's tone grew defensive. "Of course I've thought about it, Mark. Do you think this is easy for me? Every day I'm reminded of my mistakes, of everything that's happened. Maybe I just want a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life." Mark took a steadying breath, willing himself to stay calm. "I understand that, Emma, but the kids' lives and routines come first. They've been through enough upheaval, and another big change might not be fair to them." The conversation ended on a tense note, with no clear resolution. But it left Mark feeling more determined than ever to protect his children's sense of security. He knew that moving forward, he would have to be vigilant to ensure that whatever decisions were made were in their best interest. The tension surrounding Emma's potential move lingered in the background, adding an undercurrent of unease to Mark's otherwise steady routine. As he continued his path toward healing, he found solace in the little things: quiet mornings with his coffee, weekend hikes with Bella and Jamie, and moments spent with friends who'd stood by him through thick and thin. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. Mark was at work when he received a message from an unfamiliar number. The message was brief, cryptic, and piqued his curiosity. "I have information about Emma that you might want to know. Meet me at the park near your office at noon." Initially, he dismissed it, thinking it could be a prank or a scam. But the more he thought about it, the more curiosity gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, he decided to meet this mystery person, hoping it wouldn't be anything more than a strange coincidence. When he arrived at the park, he noticed a woman sitting on a bench, looking around as if she were waiting for someone. She was well-dressed, with a serious expression, and as soon as she saw him, she stood up and approached. "Mark, right?" she asked, extending a hand. "My name is Sarah. I'm Adam's ex-girlfriend." Hearing her name and who she was, Mark's stomach twisted. He'd never met Adam in person and certainly hadn't expected to meet anyone associated with him. But he nodded, shaking her hand and giving her a guarded look. "Why did you want to meet?" he asked, unsure of where this was going. Sarah hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "I know this is out of the blue, but I thought you should know. Emma and Adam, they weren't just a one-time fling. It went on for months, even when she claimed she was working things out with you." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. Even after everything, he'd somehow convinced himself that Emma's betrayal hadn't been that deep, that maybe she'd only made a one-time mistake. But Sarah's revelation shattered that illusion. "I'm telling you this because I know how it feels," Sarah continued, her voice soft but steady. "Adam did the same thing to me. He made me believe we had a future, that he was committed, all while he was seeing someone else behind my back. I just thought you deserved to know the truth." Mark stood there, speechless, struggling to process everything he'd just learned. The betrayal ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. He thanked Sarah and left the park, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted, allowing him to see the full scope of the deception he'd been entangled in. That evening, Mark reflected on everything he'd been through. The revelation from Sarah was painful, but it also gave him the closure he needed to move forward without any lingering doubts. He realized that while Emma's betrayal had left scars, he no longer had to carry the burden of guilt or self-blame. The truth was finally out, and it freed him from the shackles of their past. The following days were transformative for Mark. He refocused his energy on his children, his work, and his newfound sense of self-worth. He'd been through one of the hardest chapters of his life, but he emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. With this newfound clarity, he began making plans for the future. Plans that didn't revolve around Emma or the pain of their past. He signed up for a travel course he'd always wanted to take, started saving for a family trip with the kids, and even adopted a rescue dog to bring a new, joyful presence into their home. Mark's journey taught him the resilience of the human spirit, the power of forgiveness, and the importance of self-love. And while the scars of betrayal remained, he wore them as a testament to his strength, a reminder of how far he'd come. The revelation from Sarah had opened Mark's eyes in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just anger he felt. It was a mix of sadness, betrayal, and a touch of relief. Now, for the first time since the affair had been exposed, he could see things clearly. He had no illusions about what had happened or the type of relationship Emma had kept hidden. The weight of this new truth felt strangely liberating, like he could finally stop holding out hope for something he knew wasn't there anymore. With this clarity, Mark threw himself into building a new life for himself and his children. He focused on their well-being, giving them the love and attention they needed as they adjusted to the changes in their family. But beneath this newfound purpose, there was still one final conversation he felt he needed to have with Emma. Not for closure, but for his own peace of mind. He decided to ask her to meet him at their favorite park, a place they'd often taken the kids on weekends. The park held memories of happier times, and he felt it would be a fitting place to close this chapter of their lives. When she arrived, he noticed a look of worry on her face, as if she already sensed that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. They found a quiet bench under a tree, the sun setting in the distance, casting a warm glow over the park. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound being the laughter of children playing nearby. Mark took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before he finally spoke. "Emma, I don't want to rehash everything that's happened," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But I do want you to know that I'm aware of the full extent of your relationship with Adam. I know it wasn't just a one-time thing. I know it went on for months." He watched her reaction closely, noting the way her face shifted from confusion to guilt, her eyes widening as she realized he knew the truth. She opened her mouth to say something, but Mark held up a hand, stopping her. "I don't need an explanation," he continued. "I just wanted you to know that I know, and that I'm done. Truly done. This isn't about anger or resentment. It's about moving forward, for the sake of our kids and for my own peace." Emma looked down, clearly struggling with his words. "Mark, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I've made terrible mistakes, and I wish I could take it all back, but I understand. I understand if you never want to see me again." Mark nodded, a faint smile crossing his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll still see each other for the kids, and we'll work together as parents. But as for us, this is it. It's time for both of us to move on." With that, Mark stood up, extending a hand as if to shake on their newfound arrangement. Emma took it, her hand trembling as she gripped his, her eyes misty. For a moment, they were just two people at the end of a long, painful journey, acknowledging the finality of their shared past. As Mark walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The weight he'd been carrying for so long seemed to lighten with each step, as if he were finally free from the shadows of betrayal and heartbreak. It was a bittersweet ending, but he knew that this was the only way forward. In the days that followed, Mark found himself looking forward to a future he was creating on his own terms. He took the kids on their planned trip, a road trip across the state, exploring new towns and sharing stories around campfires. For the first time, he felt truly present with his children, free from the lingering thoughts that had once haunted him. Emma, meanwhile, honored their arrangement and stayed close by, choosing not to move back to Denver. They worked together to provide stability for the kids, putting aside their differences to co-parent in a way that felt healthy and respectful. And though they kept their interactions brief, Mark felt a sense of gratitude for the journey they'd shared, painful as it had been. He'd come out of it a stronger person, and he was determined to make the most of his new life. But there was one final twist Mark hadn't anticipated. One evening, as he was preparing dinner, he received a call from his lawyer. She sounded excited, a stark contrast to the usual businesslike tone she kept. "Mark, I have some good news. I don't know if you remember, but there was a case against Adam's employer, a lawsuit for misconduct. It seems that as part of the settlement, they're awarding damages to affected families. You and your children are eligible for a substantial sum." Mark was stunned, momentarily at a loss for words. This unexpected windfall felt like a silver lining, a way to help secure his children's future and provide a buffer as he continued rebuilding his life. It wasn't about the money. It was about the sense of justice, knowing that the damage caused by Adam's actions wasn't going unpunished. With this newfound support, Mark decided to invest in a small property, a cabin by the lake, a place where he and the kids could escape from the pressures of everyday life. The cabin became their sanctuary, a place of healing and connection. They spent weekends there, fishing, hiking, and enjoying the peace that nature had to offer. Each trip brought them closer, helping them rebuild their family bond. Looking back, Mark saw the journey he'd been on, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the path to self-discovery. He'd been broken, tested, and ultimately transformed by the challenges he'd faced. And though he would carry the scars of those experiences, he was no longer defined by them. He had found a new purpose in life, rooted in his role as a father and his commitment to living authentically, no matter what the future held. In the end, Mark's story is a testament to resilience, to the power of forgiveness, and to the strength it takes to rebuild after life knocks you down. He'd faced his darkest fears and come out the other side with a renewed sense of hope, ready to face whatever lay ahead with courage and an open heart. If you enjoyed this story, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible journeys of resilience and personal growth. Life is full of unexpected twists, but it's in those moments of struggle that we often find our greatest strengths. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next story. Mark's decision to purchase the lakeside cabin brought him and his kids a renewed sense of calm, but underneath it all, he knew there was still one last hurdle he needed to cross. Life was slowly finding its rhythm again, yet he sensed there was something unresolved lingering in the background. The truth about Emma and Adam's long affair was a wound that had healed, But Mark knew that for his own peace of mind, he had to confront Adam directly. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mark decided to take that step. He had found out that Adam worked at a yoga studio across town, a different one from where Emma had initially taken classes. As he pulled into the parking lot, he felt a rush of emotions. Anger, sadness, even a bit of nervousness. But more than anything, he felt ready. Ready to face this man who had been such a shadow in his life, to find closure by finally addressing the person who had contributed to the pain and betrayal he'd carried for so long. As he walked into the studio, the front desk attendant gave him a friendly smile. Mark asked if Adam was available, explaining that he was an old friend. She nodded, pointing to a hallway at the back of the studio. Mark thanked her and made his way down the hall, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He found Adam in a small room organizing equipment. When Adam looked up and saw Mark standing in the doorway, his expression shifted from surprise to recognition, and then to something like discomfort. "Mark," Adam said, his voice low, "I didn't expect to see you here." Mark took a steadying breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I didn't expect to be here either, but I think we both know why I am." Adam seemed to shrink a bit under Mark's gaze, his confidence faltering. "Look, Mark, I don't know what you want me to say. I know what happened between Emma and me was wrong. I've lost a lot because of it too. It wasn't worth it. I can see that now." For a moment, Mark just stared at him, absorbing the words but feeling unmoved. It was clear that Adam felt some level of regret, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage he'd caused. Still, Mark knew that the purpose of this confrontation wasn't about making Adam feel bad. It was about Mark taking back control over a chapter of his life that had been defined by deception. "It's not about making you feel guilty, Adam," Mark said, his tone firm but controlled. "This is about my peace, not your redemption. I just need to know why. Why did you do it?" Adam looked down, seemingly searching for words. After a long pause, he finally met Mark's gaze. "I think, at the time, I convinced myself it was harmless, that it was just something casual. But the truth is, I didn't think about the consequences. I was selfish, plain and simple. I never thought about you or your kids, or what it would do to your family. And I'm sorry." Mark listened, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. The apology was far too late to repair the damage, but hearing it allowed Mark to let go of the last remnants of anger he'd been holding on to. He nodded, taking in Adam's words, and for the first time he felt a sense of closure. "Thank you for being honest," Mark replied quietly. "I needed to hear that, but this is the last time we'll be having this conversation. I'm moving on, and I hope you can find a way to live with what you've done." With that, Mark turned and walked out, feeling a strange lightness as he left the studio. The confrontation had been brief, but it had given him the release he'd been searching for. It was the end of a painful chapter, and he was ready to leave it behind for good. That evening, Mark went home to his kids, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. They spent the night watching movies and laughing, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt truly present, unburdened by the ghosts of his past. In the weeks that followed, Mark focused on creating new traditions with Bella and Jamie, making the most of every moment they spent together. He took up new hobbies, started hiking more regularly, and even began painting, a passion he'd set aside years ago. Each day felt like a step forward, a chance to embrace the life he was building from scratch. As winter approached, Mark decided to host a holiday gathering at the cabin, inviting close friends and family to celebrate the season. The cabin was decorated with lights and garlands, the air filled with the scent of pine and freshly baked cookies. For Mark, it was a chance to surround himself with the people who'd supported him through his journey, to celebrate the strength and resilience that had brought him to this new chapter. On the evening of the gathering, as everyone mingled and laughed, Mark took a moment to step outside, breathing in the crisp winter air. He looked out at the lake, its surface shimmering under the moonlight, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had survived the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the challenges of rebuilding his life. And in the process, he had discovered a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Returning inside, he found Bella and Jamie laughing with friends, their faces lit with joy. Watching them, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that everything he had endured had been worth it to give them a life filled with love and security. He had faced the hardest moments of his life and had come out stronger, ready to face whatever the future held. As the night went on, Mark's heart felt lighter, filled with the love of those around him. His journey had been long and painful, but he had finally found peace. The shadows of his past no longer haunted him, and he knew that he was ready to embrace the life that lay ahead. The holiday gathering at the cabin marked a turning point in Mark's journey. Surrounded by laughter, warmth, and the love of friends and family, he finally felt that he was stepping into a new chapter. The memories of betrayal and heartache had once loomed over him, casting a shadow on his life, but now they felt distant, like echoes from a story he'd long since left behind. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was truly living. Over the following months, Mark embraced the changes he'd worked so hard to create. He had come out of this painful experience with a deeper understanding of himself and a newfound resilience that carried him through even the most challenging days. Life with his kids took on a new rhythm, one marked by joy, gratitude, and a genuine bond that had only grown stronger. Bella and Jamie thrived in this environment, finding stability and peace in the life they were building together. Emma remained in the children's lives, and while her relationship with Mark was limited to brief exchanges about their kids, it was amicable. The bitterness that had once consumed their conversations had faded, replaced by a quiet mutual understanding. Both of them had moved on in their own ways, accepting that their paths had diverged. It wasn't the life they'd originally envisioned, but it was the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Emma, too, seemed to have found a sense of peace, dedicating herself to her role as a mother and working to rebuild her own life apart from Mark. One day, as Mark was driving home from work, he noticed something unusual. He passed by a small art gallery he'd never seen before, and in the window, there was a flyer for a local art showcase. His interest was piqued. After years of setting aside his own passions, he'd recently picked up painting again, using it as a form of therapy and self-expression. The flyer seemed like a sign, a chance to share a part of himself he'd rediscovered. With some encouragement from his kids, he decided to submit a few of his paintings for the showcase. When the event arrived, he felt a mix of excitement and nerves as he walked into the gallery, his work displayed alongside that of other local artists. Bella and Jamie were there, cheering him on, and the pride in their eyes reminded him that he was more than a father and ex-husband. He was someone with his own dreams and talents. The showcase was a success, and it wasn't long before Mark began dedicating more time to his art, finding a renewed purpose in his work. His pieces reflected his journey, the pain, the healing, and the resilience that had brought him to this moment. Through art, he found a new way to connect with others, sharing his story without words. As the years went by, Mark continued to build a life rooted in authenticity and gratitude. His experiences had taught him the importance of resilience, the power of forgiveness, and the value of self-discovery. His relationship with Bella and Jamie grew even closer, and together, they navigated the challenges and triumphs of life as a family. Mark had learned to let go of the past, and in doing so, he had made room for new joys and opportunities. Emma eventually moved on as well, finding her own path and working to create a stable environment for the kids. She continued to be a part of their lives, and over time, the animosity between her and Mark faded completely. Their shared goal was the well-being of Bella and Jamie, and they both found peace in knowing that their kids were loved and cared for. In the final chapter of this journey, Mark looked back on the man he had been, the man who had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and loss. He was no longer that person. He had grown, changed, and transformed into someone stronger and wiser. His heart was open to new experiences, to the love of his family, and to the possibilities that lay ahead. One summer evening, as he sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset with Bella and Jamie by his side, he realized how far he'd come. This place, this moment, felt like home. He had weathered the storm and come out the other side, not just surviving but thriving. The scars of his past remained, but they were a testament to his resilience, reminders of a journey that had led him to this place of peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the lake, Mark felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had given him a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. He turned to his kids, smiling as they laughed and shared stories, and he knew that they, too, had found healing in this new life they had built together. This story is a reminder that even in the face of heartbreak, there is hope. We all have the strength to rebuild, to find joy again, and to create a life filled with love and purpose. Sometimes life doesn't go the way we planned, but that doesn't mean we can't find happiness on the other side of pain. Mark's journey was one of resilience, courage, and ultimately, redemption. He'd taken the pieces of a shattered life and turned them into something beautiful. If you enjoyed this story and want more inspiring journeys, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for future videos. We all face challenges, but together, we can find the strength to overcome them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.